You're listening to OPIS Talks, where you'll be in on conversations with insiders in the energy, chemicals, and environmental commodities markets. Guests share insights into the latest trends and innovations, industry challenges, and much more. Let's dive into the conversations that explore where the energy economy is headed, right here on OPIS Talks.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the latest Opus Talks podcast. This is the second episode of our Tariff Talk podcast. With me again today, Charles Dayton. How you doing, Charles?
Hey, James. Thanks for having me.
So I think last time we recorded one of these was a couple of days before the war started, and I don't know that it was the most insightful prediction, but we did expect the war to start, and sure enough, it had started by the time our podcast went to air, and I think the world has kind of evolved, and thinking around the war has changed a lot over the last, 4.5 weeks, something like that. It seems to me, look, there are a lot of implications here, and we'll get into these. The the core of the whole thing seems to me, how long does this go on for? And I was down at a conference, World Chemical Forum in Houston last week, and that was kind of the biggest discussion point outside of the, kind of direct implications on commodities and so forth. But I think early on people were thinking, okay, this will be a few strikes, and then the US and Israel walk away, like what happened in June of last year. We seem to have moved into a new, kind of somewhat changed and continually evolving playing field here. I wondered if you could give us not only your thoughts on how this ends, but some of the considerations. And I know some of these considerations you're feeling as are not talked about maybe enough in the general coverage. You want to just walk us through what you're thinking?
Yeah, sure. And so, first and foremost, it may seem a little kind of strange having me pontificate on war strategy and things like that. But just for those of you that don't know, I'm a decorated Iraq War veteran, former Army officer, did 2 combat tours on the ground, front lines in Iraq. So, I've had a whole lot to do with kind of the Middle East and the Shias and the Sunnis and this entire relationship here. So kind of relying on some of the experiences there too as we talk about this. But first, to your point, you kind of said, what kind of timeline do we see of this ending? I would posit back to you, kind of what are our standards for saying this has ended?
Mm.
And that's difficult to say. I don't think we're all singing from one sheet of music. And by we all, I mean not only the US and Iran, but as we've been saying internally with this one, it kind of takes three to taco here, right? That this cannot just be Donald Trump kind of declaring victory and moving on, because you're going to have buy-in from Iran. They're going to have to, at least in some form or another, open back up the Strait of Hormuz to traffic, among other things. And not only that, you're going to have to bring Israel along too, and develop conditions that they agree to, that they want to um, go with as well. If the goal is kind of, as we've been communicating it recently, that we want Hormuz back open, we don't want Iran to be pursuing any nuclear ambitions. That's kind of the agreement we had before the attack started. So that status quo was not acceptable to Israel and to the U.S. So it's difficult to see why it would be now. So that being said, kind of what would we see, or what off ramp would be acceptable to all three, the US, Iran, and Israel, right? And it's difficult to say. If we say we want the Iranian government to open back up Hormuz, we want them to allow the free flow of traffic and stop nuclear enrichment, kind of as we just said, Israel would probably come back to you and say, we want, the end of the Iranian regime, that they see them as an existential threat to the country, and that's kind of how they see it instead. So because I can't see a very good agreement where everybody says, yeah, we all agree this is what we should do, I have a lot of trouble seeing an end here. You take that further, if Israel really does want to kind of degrade and destroy the Iranian regime and government, if part of any agreement is to no longer block Hormuz or charge tolls for ships going through, or pay in Chinese yuan or whatever the Iranians are doing, who is going to enforce that if there's no longer a legitimate central leadership? So this is the problem here is I don't really, it's kind of hard to see an agreement that everyone would come to that they'd all be okay with that could actually be enforced. And until we see that, I have trouble thinking, okay, this happens tomorrow and therefore the war ends. And if there's ever been anything that I've hoped more that I'd be wrong about, it's this right here, because this is not a fun situation to be in, as we know.
I think this one's really interesting. You think of wars historically, and the win condition is kind of shared by both sides. Perhaps it's territory, one side trying to get territory, the other side trying to defend it. For example, like in Ukraine right now, but certainly wars through history. This one feels very asymmetric, and something that the US and Israel may be fighting for. Iran may have a very different win condition. I mean, they came out the other day saying, well, yeah, we'll engage in peace if we're given reparations and if we get to have sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz and presumably then tariff vessels that were going through it. But it's not as simple as Iran. Okay, Iran has fought off the US, or the US gets in and takes over Iran's regime or whatever. There are other requirements being placed out there for peace that are not necessarily symmetric to each side, which I think is fascinating. Charles and I are both history nuts, by the way. We do this commodity thing and love it very much, but yeah, I think we both spend a lot of our time reading history and so on. Our base case is that this ends mid-year, or at least reopening of the Strait of Hormuz is this year. I think that is incredibly uncertain right now, and I certainly see scenarios where this goes a lot longer. I think if troops go in, obviously, that's a big sign that this will be a significantly longer duration. What do you think the markets are saying about the duration of this, Charles?
I think you're probably pretty close on that. If you look at that, we like to look at, while it's not a price forecast, we like to look at the forward strip of pricing. We get Brent back down below 100 by August. We get WTI just broke over 100, what, today, right? That we're back down kind of into the 80s by August. So, the markets are kind of saying the same thing, that this won't be that long lived, but and we saw we've if you read our articles, you've seen a lot about us talking about kind of the jawboning done, especially by this administration. And I've never seen on either side propaganda kind of as big as we've seen during this war, not only coming from our side, but Lego AI movies coming out of Iran against us and things like that. It's just amazing to see. When you see, for example, today, President Trump said that the new regime was better to negotiate with, and he called it more reasonable. And his negotiations kind of said that, he was enthusiastic about it in terms of things going forward, which led a lot of people to believe that, maybe things won't last as long as people say. And while that's certainly possible, James, I would just say put yourself in the position of the new Ayatollah here in Iran, that your family was surprise attacked by a U.S. and Israeli, the two of them attacking you during peace negotiations, bombing your family's house, killing your father, killing your wife, killing several members of your family, wounding at least probably and disfiguring you as well. And you're going to be a more reasonable representative when it comes to negotiations. I mean, this feels to me a little bit like wishful thinking, right? That one of the problems with this is we kind of started it out. I think the plan was decapitation strike, take out the Ayatollah, people rise up on the streets, and we have a new Iran tomorrow. And it doesn't seem to have worked out that way. So while it's very true that you may have a more reasonable regime here that wants to negotiate going forward, I have a problem figuring out to what end that, again, both the US and Israel and even Iran would all agree to. But not only that, the conditions to negotiate, your entire family's been killed in surprise attack airstrikes. It doesn't strike me as you'd be more amenable to negotiations than the people, before that happened. That's the problem. So even though the markets are saying mid-year and we are taking our cue from the markets, I worry, and again, I hope I'm wrong, that might be wishful thinking for those reasons above.
No, I think it's a very valid question to be asking. Obviously, commodities are the story here, and what we're here to talk about. Why don't we start with crude? Obviously, focusing on impacts on our commodities, and for the audience, I know this podcast goes more broadly than just to our clients. Charles and I primarily cover commodities that are either used in production of electricity, so coal, natural gas, renewables and so forth, and also commodities used in steelmaking. But crude, obviously, an important part of all of those commodities. What are your thoughts around it, Charles?
Yeah, sure. So an easy way to kind of look at crude right now when you see these numbers thrown out, again, to your point to people that don't really follow it as closely as we do, the world consumes about 100 million barrels per day of oil, pretty close to that, maybe a little more, but we can just use 100 kind of to make life easy. So every time 1 million barrels per day comes out, that's 1% of the global market. So if we look back historically at some of the big events that really affected the global markets in a significant way, and we'll talk about this with the petrodollar here in a few minutes, but the Arab oil embargo of 73, 74 was about 7% of global supply. The Iranian Revolution, when the popular was overthrew the Shah, and we had the embassy crisis and all of that back around 1978, 79, was about 5% of supply. When Saddam came in and invaded Kuwait, set a bunch of their oil fields on fire, and we basically embargoed Iraqi oil as well. That was about 9%. Now, back then, crude oil prices rose over 100% over the intervening months of when that happened. And of that 9%, about three quarters of it, Saudi Arabia had excess capacity and made up for it. So you're looking at a whole lot less than that. So today we're looking at WTI this morning. We're getting pretty close to 100% increase from the lows at the start of the year. But about 20% of oil came offline with Hormuz. Now you'll get answers of, well, some of that oil can go through the East-West pipeline and it can be exported, down through the south, and that's another way to get it out of Saudi, and that's true. But as we saw this weekend, the Houthis went ahead and fired a bunch of missiles over there at Israel, and the Houthis control not the Strait of Hormuz, but the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is the other one that handles all the oil coming out of there. So if we're looking at that getting shut down too, we've effectively landlocked, 20 million barrels. Again, do our easy math. That's 20 of 100. That's 20% of um, global daily supply. Now,
It's
we're
worth
not even talking.
noting. It's worth noting that too. This is going eastward, so yes, you can pipe across Saudi some of it, but it's not like you're then sending that through the Suez, right? You still want to sail it eastward, so you have to manage the Houthi risk.
Yeah, and the East will get hit. We were already seeing it, right? I mean, James, you're Australian. You've seen some of the issues they're already talking about in Australia and New Zealand with oil and rationing and things already. It's going to eventually make its way west too. But, James, we haven't even talked about Russia. And Ukraine's very effectively hit several Russian refineries and ports here in the last few weeks. Last I read, about 40% of their export capacity is down, or another 2 million barrels per day. So we've seen oil prices little less to around 100%, depending on the index you're looking at, rally here with an over 20% loss to global markets potentially. So we've had a lot of good things going for us. Seasonality, we're not in a heating oil season or things like that. As well as we had high inventories. IEA announced the largest release of inventories in history and a combined one to try and stem this. But, when you start to add up the numbers, it doesn't last a whole lot longer before we start to run into some serious issues. And again, it's the biggest energy disruption of my lifetime, of probably anyone listening to this' lifetime, if ever. Prices have not responded yet, kind of like people feared they would. This is back to your argument that we are making as well, that this will be wrapped up in a few months. If it's not, though, it's a concern, right? There's a lot of disruption here. And it's not just oil either, right? I know you did a piece on LNG, and I would argue that the LNG piece is even more interesting than the oil side.
I think it may prove to be. Yeah, I mean, since this war started, I was down in Colombia for a week. We have a conference down there, and pretty much every conversation started with, "What's this going to do to LNG?" And obviously coal producers and coal consumers outlooks for the rest of the year are tied on how this impacts LNG. Yeah, I mean, one of the big questions that's being raised, and you're talking similar percentages, right? I think at 20 something percent of global LNG goes over the Gulf. I've heard people say as high as 30, but it's a significant amount. This really raises some questions around the reliability of LNG, and that's something that we keep hearing from clients. Yeah, we've had, we had one utility reaching out to us saying, hey, what's going on? They wanted us to do a little mini project on the implications from this because they've built a lot of combined cycle gas units, and they were sort of supposed to be this reliable but cleaner alternative to coal, good way to sort of diversify your generation fleet. And suddenly, a commodity that seemed very reliable, a few months ago, and certainly very reliable before the Russia-Ukraine war started, is looking less reliable. Not only that, but until this war started, every analyst who covers LNG or its related fuels had been saying there's a big oversupply coming. There's a whole lot of new liquefaction capacity coming on in the US, coming on in Qatar, and then in a few other countries as well, Papua New Guinea, a couple of countries in Africa. And that narrative has really faded very quickly. And it might still be there. There is still an awful lot of capacity coming online, but it's very unlikely to be the case this year. And I think if this thing doesn't wrap up quickly, it won't be the case at all. But on the reliability question, you have four countries who supply more than 75% of the world's LNG. The United States is the biggest, and US supply is not impacted by this war, but there have already been questions around tariffs and counter tariffs, and okay, if I bought a term deal for LNG out of one of the US liquefaction facilities, and I locked that in 5 years ago, but the country I'm in put in a 20% counter tariff on the US. Now I'm paying more for that LNG than I ever thought I would be. The US also, a significant portion of that capacity is in hurricane affected areas. Second biggest supplier is Qatar. Obviously, we see what's happening there, but I think one of the questions going forward is Iran, I think, has learned that they have a significant amount of leverage here, and just threatening attacks on vessels, I think, will be enough to keep vessel owners out of the Gulf, certainly spike insurance rates and all of that. The third biggest supplier is Australia, and Australia doesn't, I think, have any kind of sovereign risk and so forth, but northern Western Australia and Queensland get hit by cyclones each year. And then the fourth biggest LNG supplier is Russia. And, Russian LNG is cut off from a lot of countries. So I think a lot of questions being asked around how reliable LNG either is or how reliable it's going to be in coming years. And, our collective view is that probably works to sustain thermal coal generation longer than it would have otherwise.
Yeah,
So,
and
yeah.
to your point, the Iranians targeted a couple of Qatari trains, right, down in their largest LNG
Mm.
liquefaction facility. I think they said, what, 3 to 5 years it could be offline here. So going
Yeah,
into
the
next winter, if we're
cooling.
continuing to have our war with Russia and everything, it gets interesting, doesn't it?
Yeah, they have, I forget the name of them right now, but the cooling boxes, basically there are critical pieces of equipment required to liquefy LNG, and there are multi-year waiting periods for those because there's been so much LNG supply coming online. I think everyone, back in the 2010s, there was a huge build out in LNG, and then there was too big a build out. But then when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was, suddenly all of these dormant projects were brought back to life. And as a result, orders for liquefaction materials, have huge backlogs. So bringing back, this portion of Ras Laffan that is offline, yeah, I think that will be a multi-year deal. One thing, to note, we do think this is supportive for thermal coal demand. It's a tricky one. You can look at coal capacity and gas capacity, and you can think to yourself, all right, well, this is how much could switch, therefore, losing X amount of LNG will create Y amount of thermal coal demand. We tend to fade the impact a little bit. I think, if this persists through mid-year, I think you're talking somewhere in the range 20 to 30 million tons of extra thermal coal demand. To be clear, that extra buying will be spread over a sort of an extended period of time. But yeah, we think probably if this goes through mid-year, we're talking 20 to 30 million tons. But there are lots of nuances there. For example, countries where, because of high prices, it's becoming difficult to get letters of credit. And we may have countries that want to import more coal to compensate for losing LNG, but they're not able to get LCs to execute that. So it tends to be, if you do add up all the countries and how much in theory could switch, the actual amounts in our view tend to be a fair bit smaller than that. The only other thing I'd say on the commodity impacts, we've obviously seen bunker fuels rise dramatically, and that's pushing freight rates higher. Freight rates are already high because vessels are sailing further. People going around the Cape of Good Hope versus through the Suez, for example. And high diesel prices obviously impact mining costs. So, that's an important consideration as well. We would, of course, expect both of those to fade as this ends, but they are an important driver of commodity pricing, particularly on a delivered basis. There's also some discussion about potential bunker shortages, in Singapore and Panama, maybe Fujairah in the UAE as well. And if you just can't fuel your vessel because a given location doesn't have the bunker fuel you need, that's obviously a bit of a game changer. Look, I think the last topic we wanted to talk about was, Charles, you did a nice piece the other day on the petrodollar. And I think I've definitely, there are articles on this online, and it's a good article I saw in the Wall Street Journal talking about it. But Iran has an angle here where they see that they can benefit by weakening the petrodollar. Can you maybe start by explaining what the petrodollar is, but then talk us through what you think Iran can do and what their strategy is in terms of weakening US dollar trade.
Yeah, sure. So if our subscribers go back and read kind of what we've written before, we talked about how as World War II was coming to a close, the only kind of manufacturing and industrial power that was left relatively unscathed was the United States. And as a result, in Bretton Woods, everyone came together and said, okay, the US dollar will be the reserve and it'll be pegged to gold and everyone else will peg off of the dollar. And that was basically the macro monetary construct around the world for the next roughly 30 or so years until 1971, Richard Nixon took us off of the gold standard. Intervening, we had, as we talked about a few minutes ago, we had the Arab oil embargo in 73, 74. Well, come around 74, we kind of decided we needed something to hang our hat on for the dollar to continue to make it be in demand globally and to be the global reserve currency. And that something was oil. It's kind of more recently been fully released what we did, but essentially we went to Saudi Arabia and said, look, you settle all of your oil transactions in the dollar, and in exchange, we'll provide technical support and defense support for you. We provide some security for Saudi Arabia. Over the next few years, we talked to the other oil OPEC members, at least the Gulf Coast country ones, and got them lined up behind the dollar too, and dollar transactions were done in dollars. I'm sorry, oil transactions were done in dollars, and that's all she wrote. Until a few years ago, anyone who's ever stepped out of line and kind of not decided to use dollars anymore, Libya was one of them, and Saddam Hussein was another, and I'll let people kind of draw their own conclusions about kind of the importance of the petrodollar to us, among other things, and how we responded to that, but it's clearly very important. So now a couple of things are going on. First, Iran is allowing some ships through Hormuz. It's not a complete blockade, but they're insisting that all of those transactions for oil are done in Chinese yuan instead of dollars. And this is, in our view, an attempt to kind of move the world away from the US dollar, petrodollar linkage. In addition to that, we're seeing a lot of Iranian attacks not just on kind of Israel as our war gamers expected, but across the Gulf too. And you're seeing a lot of different pundits saying this is acting out of panic or frustration from Iran. Iran is saying we're mostly targeting, only U.S. facilities there, which is true, but it's also mostly they're hitting civilian facilities as well. Are they just doing this kind of out of panic or response? Again, part of that agreement was that the U.S. would provide defensive support to these countries, and Iran doing this kind of shows that that's not necessarily as ironclad as these countries thought it was. Iran's kind of approaching this from two different points, right? From one, they are insisting that transactions are done in another currency, in this case, Chinese yuan. And then on the other side, they're also insisting that they're showing that these defensive protections by the US are not necessarily ironclad. So this is actually, I think, a pretty clever way to undermine that petrodollar linkage here. We'll see how well it works and how well it works going forward. But I'm an American. I want our country to succeed. Our administration needs to realize that this is a very important basis for the dollar continuing to be used as a reserve currency. And downplaying our defense commitments or things like that is probably not the best way to continue that going here. It's an important aspect that I think is kind of not taken into account as much as it probably should be, among the global pundits.
Fascinating stuff, and we'll be recording again in a month, and I'll be really interested to see the status of the war at that point. Look, I think probably both of our guts are that this thing does continue for a while. I think if we see boots on the ground in Iran, I think that's a clear sign that this thing will continue for quite a while. I think all of us hoping that we do find peace here, but I think the longer this goes on, commodity impacts amplify, and it is not easy to switch away from Qatar as an LNG supplier. We're in the shoulder season now, so right now, if you're a country that consumes gas that you bought as LNG, perhaps you can run your coal plants harder in the shoulder season. But come the summer, most utilities don't have enough excess generation to just do that. So I think it really, if this does continue into the summer in particular, I think those commodity impacts amplify. With that, I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you very much for your comments as usual, Charles, and we will see everybody next month.
Yeah, James, thanks for having me, and let's hope we have something different to talk about next month.
It would be nice. Thanks, everyone.
We hope you've enjoyed today's insider conversation on OPIS Talks. Join us next time for a deep dive into another industry insider's world. You can find more OPIS Talks episodes at opisnet.com/podcasts or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.